Hello, friends, and welcome to our fifth and final study of the life of Abraham, part of the story in Genesis of God's establishing a people for himself. We will examine chapters 22 through 25 of Genesis. That includes the stories of the offering up of Isaac, the death of Sarah, part of the story of the bride for Isaac, and the death of Abraham. In doing that, I will be sharing some scholarly findings that might seem irrelevant at first, but it will yield sound interpretation of the accounts necessary to correctly apply the truths therein to our lives. And isn't that why we study the Bible? We begin with chapter 2 with a story called the Akedah Yitzhak, Hebrew for binding of Isaac, also referred to as the offering up of Isaac, which for me is the centerpiece of Genesis, if not the entire Old Testament. And remember, like all the other stories in the Bible, the binding of Isaac is not about the characters and their dramas, but about revealing the nature and character of God and his plan to redeem lost sinners. And of all the biblical stories, the Akedah has been recognized to well point to that. Much controversy has surrounded Genesis 22 throughout the centuries in both Jewish and Christian circles, and we will discuss why that has been so. For now, let's begin to read the story of the binding of Isaac, where it says in verse 1, "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.'" From the beginning, we learn that God's plan is to test Abraham, but we are not yet told what he is being tested for. And in verse 2, it goes on to say, "Then he said, 'Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.'" Notice that the name of the mountain Abraham is directed to is not given. Only the land where the mountain exists is provided, the land of Moriah. Yet it has been a tradition that Mount Moriah is where the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is located, and I think that it's worthwhile to explore why that is so. Now, it has been maintained in both Judaism and Christianity that after David captured the city of the Jebusites, Jebus, in 1003 BC, later renaming it Jerusalem, he moved the tabernacle from Kiriath Jearim to the threshing floor of Arna the Jebusite, the traditional site of the Akedah, or Mount Moriah. The Mount Moriah tradition evolved from 2 Chronicles 3:1, where it says, "Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Arna, the Jebusite, the place provided by David." Note that there is no reference in Chronicles to the binding of Isaac on Mount Moriah, in regard to the site of Solomon's temple anyways. Neither is anything said about the temple being built on the site of the binding of Isaac. Also, it is to consider that if the site of the Akedah had been Jerusalem, whose surrounding hills were lush with trees, we have to ask, why would Isaac have been burdened with carrying wood for the sacrifice? Since it has been estimated that Abraham and Isaac trekked 40 miles from Beersheba, based on a 3 days journey, in a 40-mile circumference, there would have been barren places that would have required bringing enough wood for the sacrifice. Further, Abraham had been near to Jebus before when he encountered Melchizedek in Salem. So it is to ask, why was the site God sent them to not called Salem, an archaic name for Jerusalem? My point here is that Mount Moriah, which is not mentioned in Genesis 22, as is the land of Moriah, became the traditional mount of the Akedah in Judaism. So why would the writer of the book of Chronicles refer to Mount Zion or Jerusalem as Mount Moriah. Zion and Mount Zion remain the place name for the city of David to the 1st century when John wrote, "Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb." Revelation 14:1. Recovered clay tablets reveal that the Jebusites, a Canaanite tribe mentioned in Joshua 15 and Judges 1, occupied Jebus for 2,000 years at the time of Abraham until David conquered them in 1003 BC. 2 Samuel 5, 1 Chronicles 1. So it is to ask, why would Abraham have been directed by God to sacrifice Isaac in an occupied city? Well, the writer of Chronicles, who many agree was Ezra, the 5th century priestly scribe and reformer of Judaism, composed Chronicles to update the Book of Kings of the 7th century BC. If Ezra was the author of Chronicles, he would have composed it to benefit his religious reform of the second generation of returnees from Babylonian exile. Central to Chronicles was that the land of Israel was God's homeland for the Jews, that the Davidic monarchy was God's way of unifying Israel, with the temple being the means of centralizing worship in Jerusalem. And so, to validate Jerusalem as God's choice for his temple, I take it that the author of Chronicles wrote that the Temple Mount was the mount on which Abraham offered up Isaac. 2 Chronicles 3:1. To this day, Jews maintain that Jerusalem is their capital city from long before the Palestinians occupied it, maintaining that Father Abraham had built an altar there to offer up Isaac. And this is a great example of geopolitics. So, where might the land of Moriah, with its unnamed mountain that Abraham was directed to, be located? The only place name that comes close to the land of Moriah is the land of Moreh, a difference of just one letter, a yud, that is located in Samaria. In fact, Samaritan Jews continue to call Samaria the land of Moreh, claiming that it was on one of the hills there, near Shechem, where Abraham offered up Isaac. If you will recall, the Lord appeared to Abraham at the terebinth of Moreh, where he built an altar, Genesis 12:6. And so why should we be concerned about the location of where Abraham offered up Isaac? Well, for one, we should be aware of the geopolitical reason Israel maintains that Mount Zion and Mount Moriah are the same place, since it sidesteps the spiritual significance of Genesis 22, which is what we are trying to determine in the study. And as we lead up to that determination, what we can be most certain of is that Jesus was not sacrificed on Mount Moriah or on Mount Zion or Jerusalem proper, but outside of Jerusalem on a mount called Golgotha. Now, getting back to the story where God has just commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, it is to ask, why would Abraham not protest such a thing, at least as he had over the people of Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, I can think of three possible reasons. To begin with, he might have actually protested, but it was omitted from the account. Even if he had protested, he didn't change God's mind. Secondly, child sacrifice was normative in the ancient Near East. Abraham would have been familiar with this practice from his Mesopotamian roots, where infants were sacrificed to the gods of Molech and Chemosh. Yet Isaac wasn't an infant, being either a young child or a teenager. Some even calculate that he was well into his adulthood, in his 30s. However, it would have been difficult for an old man to bind the hands and feet of a teenager or an adult, so it is more likely the case that Isaac was a small child. Now, there is a biblical case of sacrificing an older child found in 2 Kings 3, where it is told that King Mesha of Moab, fearing that he would lose the battle with the Israelites, killed his oldest son and hung his corpse on the wall of the city for the Israelite troops to witness. verse 27. In doing so, Mesha knew that the Israelites would fear that the Moabite God would respond to his sacrifice and give him the victory. And he assumed correctly, for the Israelite troops fled. We know from Jeremiah and the writer of the book of 2 Kings that Judah practiced infant sacrifice. King Manasseh of Judah of the 7th century BC and his successors sacrificed their infants to Moloch, and this was long after the time of Abraham. Jeremiah 19 and 2 Kings 21. And the third reason Abraham would not have protested sacrificing his son is that he thought God would either change his mind and stop the sacrifice, or if he had sacrificed Isaac, that God would resurrect him. But from where would Abraham have gotten the concept of resurrection? Well, having spent time in Egypt, he would have known about the Egyptian god of the dead, Osiris, who was said to have been murdered by his brother Set and brought back to life by his mother Isis. Since it is not known if Abraham ever witnessed a resurrection, it is unlikely that he would consider that would happen, but instead that God would change his mind and stay the sacrifice. And it continues to say in verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. Having seen the place from afar off suggests that he recognized it from having been there before. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Now, in telling his servants that he and Isaac would come back to them, indicates that Abraham believed that Isaac would live after all. So in verse 6, we are told that Abraham proceeded to sacrifice Isaac, where it says, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. So it is to ask, does Abraham believe that God would provide a substitute lamb for Isaac, or would Isaac be that lamb? Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And this is where Abraham's obedience to his God is demonstrated, a very radical form of obedience. Now, it doesn't say here that Isaac protested in any way, and if he hadn't, he is the greater exemplar of obedience, surrendering to both his God and to his father. And in verse 11, we are told that as Abraham proceeds to slay Isaac, he is interrupted, where it says, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And so God's reason for the test is clarified here, to see if Abraham truly feared or revered God, to where he would obey God at whatever the cost to him, even surrendering his most cherished son to God. And this has been the subject of many sermons meant to compel believers to examine themselves to see just how obedient they have been to God's commands. Yet there is more to this story for us to embrace. Never wanting Isaac to be slain, God halts the sacrifice and then provides a substitute. In verse 13, it says, Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Jehovah Yireh, what is called Jehovah Jireh, the German pronunciation that substitutes the letter Yud for J. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice, which in Christianity is the redemption of sinners through Christ. But had Abraham failed his test, he would not be blessed as promised in the covenants of chapters 12 and 15. So here God reiterates his covenant promises from chapters 12 and 15 with an additional promise that his descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. Recall from our last study that the gate refers to the seat of city government of the ancient Near East, which tells us that God promised Abraham that his descendants would rule over Canaan. The Akedah ends in verse 19, where it says, So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham dwelt in Beersheba. Now, there has been an age-old controversy in Jewish circles as to whether Abraham had actually sacrificed Isaac. And this is mainly due to the last verse in which Abraham returned to his young men with no mention of Isaac returning with him. Yet based on the next passage where Isaac takes a bride, the obvious would be that he had been sacrificed, but God had resurrected him. However, had Isaac been resurrected, why would such an incredible thing not have been included in Genesis 22 or elsewhere in the Bible? The tradition of Isaac having been sacrificed was not only found in Jewish commentary, but it is supported in the documentary hypothesis, which identifies verses 1 through 10 with the Elohist writer that ends with, And Abraham put out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. The sacrifice is interrupted with what is believed to be the contribution of the Yahwist writer. And further support of an actual sacrifice is found in verse 16, where it says, That you did this thing and didn't withhold your son, your only one, that I'll bless you and multiply your seed. So it is to ask, what does this thing mean? Could it be that the sacrifice was so egregious that the angel couldn't even say the word sacrifice? And does pairing the phrases, this thing, with not withholding your son, equate to an actual sacrifice? Now, the last time the phrase, this thing, is used is when Abraham argues with God to not do this thing in regard to destroying Sodom. Genesis 18:25 in the Septuagint. However, in Judaism, most take it that Isaac's death was never in God's mind, nor Abraham's, but that it was a story meant to teach God's people that human sacrifice is unacceptable. Accordingly, Abraham's beloved son was to be raised up as an offering, a living offering, for it would be Isaac who would succeed his father as the progenitor of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Christian thought about the Akedah is based on the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, 17 through 19, where it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. And from our earliest theologians who recognized types and shadows of Christ in the Bible, Isaac is the best type of Christ, who appears to have surrendered to his father's will to be a sacrifice for God. Further, the story of his near sacrifice has been recognized to be a shadow of the sacrificial death of Christ. For those who believe that Isaac was actually sacrificed and then resurrected, as according to Jewish tradition, Isaac becomes a type of the resurrected Christ. And the typology of Isaac as Christ is substantiated in that both Isaac and Jesus are their father's only beloved sons, who were miraculously conceived. In fact, even Jesus is referred to as the son of Abraham, Genesis 21:3 and Matthew 1:1. Also, both Isaac and Jesus are obedient to their fathers, willing to be bound and laid on the altar of sacrifice, and doing so in silence. Both Isaac and Jesus carry the wood of the sacrifice and are bound and placed on the wood of sacrifice. Even the ram caught in the thicket is taken to be a type of Christ, whom God provided as a substitutionary sacrifice for sinners. Remember John the Baptist telling his disciples to behold Jesus as the Lamb of God, John 1:29. And the Lamb of God is witnessed by the Apostle John in his vision, slain and seated on the throne, Revelation 5. Finally, both sons are resurrected, Jesus from the dead and Isaac from his near death, both given back to their fathers on the third day. Genesis 22:4 and Luke 24:6 and 7. Then chapter 22 ends with the list of the family of Abraham's brother who stayed behind in Haran. In verse 20 it says, now it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, indeed Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Huz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Hesed, Hazo, Pildash, Didlaph, and Bethuel. And Bethuel begot Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, whose name was Rumah, also bore Tebah, Gaham, Gahash, and Maachah. The purpose of this genealogy is to introduce the future wife of Isaac, Rebekah, the great niece of Abraham, confirming that she was not the daughter of Nahor's Canaanite concubine, but of Milcah, the daughter of Abraham's deceased brother Haran. And our study continues in chapter 23 concerning the death and burial of Sarah. And in verse 1 it begins to say, Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you his burial place, that you may bury your dead. Then Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth. And he spoke with them, saying, If it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and meet with Ephron the son of Zohar for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he has, which is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me at the full price as property for a burial place among you. Again, Abraham is adamant about not wanting gifts from anyone other than his God, who was to be the only source and hope of his blessings. Now Ephron dwelt among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the presence of the sons of Heth, all who entered at the gate of his city, saying, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field and the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of the sons of my people. I give it to you. Bury your dead. Notice that it says here that they entered at the gate of the city, the official place where deeds were signed and witnessed. Then Abraham bowed himself down before the people of the land, and he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, If you will give it, please hear me. I will give you money for the field. Take it from me, and I will bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, My lord, listen to me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? So bury your dead. And Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out the silver for Ephron, which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, currency of the merchants. Now, although Ephron might have granted the land to Abraham, at any time he could take it back for his own use. But Abraham buying and deeding the property would secure it forever, for his own entombment and Isaac's, and for Isaac's family members forward. Now we are told in Genesis 50:13 that besides Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, and Jacob are buried there. In this frame is the building constructed over the cave of Machpelah in Hebron by Herod the Great, the only surviving complete building of that period. The tomb of the patriarchs, referred to as Ma'arat HaMachpelah by the Jews and the Ibrahimi Mosque by Muslims, was constructed with 6-foot thick limestone walls and originally without a roof. During the 6th century AD, a basilica was built over the shrine by the Byzantines, becoming one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Christianity. About 700 years ago, the Muslim Mamluks of Turkish origin conquered Hebron, turning the building into a mosque where Ibrahim as they call him, is venerated, banning all Jews from entering. Jews were not allowed past the 7th step on the exterior staircase, but this has changed, with Jews allowed to visit certain areas of the mosque. Due to the violent disruptions there in the past, it is well guarded by Israeli soldiers, being one of the most dangerous sites to visit in the West Bank. I have visited the mosque and found the atmosphere to be a bit eerie and tense, and the city of Hebron to be a bit unfriendly. And it continues to say in verse 17, So the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, which were within all the surrounding borders, were deeded to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the sons of Heth, before all who went in at the gate of his city. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, before Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave that is in it were deeded to Abraham by the sons of Heth as property for a burial place. And our story of Abraham continues in chapter 24 concerning a bride for Isaac. But we will only read up to verse 9, since beyond that is the story of Rebekah and Isaac, which is part of the study on Jacob and the 12 tribes of Israel. And in verse 1, it begins to say, Now Abraham was old, well advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. So Abraham said to the oldest servant of his house, who ruled over all that he had, Please put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but you shall go to my country and to my family and take a wife for my son Isaac. Marrying within the family, referred to as endogamy, was practiced to ensure a pure bloodline and the property remaining in family ownership, generation after generation. Also, the bit about Abraham asking his servant to put his hand under his thigh while swearing to obey is akin to what we do with a handshake. And in verse 5, it continues to say, And the servant said to him, Perhaps the woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I take your son back to the land from which you came? But Abraham said to him, Beware that you do not take my son back there. The Lord God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my family, and who spoke to me and swore to me, saying, To your descendants I give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. And if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be released from this oath. Only do not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. Notice that this is the second time Abraham orders his servant not to take Isaac to Haran in Mesopotamia, as if he knows that his relatives would not let him return with his bride. If you will recall, Jacob was pressured to stay in Haran by his father-in-law Laban when he married Leah and Rachel, and ended up staying there for 20 years. And in chapter 25, it appears that Abraham has become a normal man living a normal lifestyle of that culture, marrying and having children, even having concubines, and this is at a ripe old age. In verse 1 it says, Abraham again took a wife, and her name was Keturah. Now both the writers of Chronicles in the Hebrew text and the Greek Septuagint report that Keturah was Abraham's concubine, 1 Chronicles 1:32, which, if true, indicates that she would have been Abraham's concubine while Sarah was still alive. Many of the ancient rabbis have identified Keturah with Hagar, who they believe returned to Abraham after Sarah's death. Whatever the case, their offspring are understood to be the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham to be a blessing to all nations, to be blessed by the nations, as well as producing the enemies of Israel, as is the case of the descendants of Ishmael. In verses 2 through 4, Keturah's sons and grandsons are listed. And in verse 5 it says, And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had. And while he was still living, he sent them eastward, away from Isaac his son, to the country of the east. Not only did Abraham give Isaac everything while alive, in his death Isaac inherited his position of clan chieftain. And more importantly, Isaac succeeded his father as God's servant and as the progenitor of the 12 tribes of Israel through his son Jacob. In verses 7 and 8, Abraham has passed away, where it says, This is the sum of years of Abraham's life, which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Abraham dying at a good old age is the fulfillment of the promise God made to him back in chapters 15:15. And as in our own families, when relatives who have distanced themselves from one another come together to respect the dead. And it says in verse 9, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt at Beer Lahai Roi. Thank you, friends, for viewing this presentation on the life and legacy of Abraham. And I pray that God blesses you in every area of your lives for your dedication to the study of his word.